The forest was breathing, not in the way a city does, with car horns and blinking lights, but with the low hum of insects, the rustling of nocturnal creatures, and the rhythm of wind slipping between trees. Moonlight dripped through thick branches like silver rain, illuminating patches of wet leaves and tangled roots. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted, solemn and knowing. Elias stood at the edge of his porch, staring into the dark wall of pine and fog. It had been a quiet evening, until a sound broke through the usual silence. Faint, fragile, not animal, not quite human either. A cry, then a rustle, then nothing. He didn't move at first. He'd learned to let the woods be. Sometimes sound were tricks. Wind through a hollow stump, a fox yipping in the dark. But this sound, this one had a tremble to it, a kind of desperation that curled beneath the skin. Elias narrowed his eyes. He took a breath, then exhaled slowly. His fingers tightened around the handle of his lantern, its dull orange light casting long shadows along the steps. He knew these woods better than most, had lived among them off-grid for years, and still, something about that sound didn't sit right. Another moment passed. Silence. Then, just as he began to turn away, he heard it again, fainter now. A whimper? Maybe a gasp? It was hard to tell, but whatever it was weakening, dying out. He stepped off the porch. The ground was wet beneath his boots, softened by yesterday's rain. He moved carefully, letting instinct guide him. Twigs cracked underfoot, branches scraped against his coat, but his pace quickened. The cry had come from just beyond the bend. He was sure of it. He reached a clearing and held the lantern high, its glow slicing through the shadows. Nothing, but he didn't turn back. Something was here, something fragile, something broken. And even though he didn't know who or what was calling out in the dark, a weight settled in his chest. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't pretend he hadn't heard it. Not this time. He couldn't look away. Sarah had always been the kind of woman who found joy in small things. She loved the way morning sunlight poured through sheer curtains, how fresh bread smelled when pulled from the oven, and how a single compliment could brighten someone's entire day. Raised by her grandmother in a modest home on the outskirts of town, she learned early on the value of humility, kindness, and endurance. She wasn't outspoken, but she wasn't weak either, just quiet, thoughtful, and eager to create a life rooted in love. When she met Daniel, it felt like life had finally handed her a slice of joy. He was polite, well-spoken, and came from a family that, at first glance, appeared traditional but respectable. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Faison, ran a small but profitable textile business, and Daniel helped manage the accounts. Their courtship was brief. Within a few months, arrangements were made, and Sarah was married into the Faison household. At first, it all felt like a dream. She tried her best to fit in, waking up early, preparing meals, dressing conservatively, speaking softly. Her mother-in-law would watch her like a hawk, correcting her tone, her posture, even the way she folded clothes. Sarah complied without resistance, believing that effort and patience would win them over. But something changed after the first trimester of her pregnancy. Daniel, once attentive if distant, began to pull further away. He stopped joining her for meals. Their conversations shrank to one-word exchanges. When she shared the news of her pregnancy, his expression was blank. No joy, no excitement, just a small nod as he continued scrolling through his phone. Her in-laws, however, reacted far more openly and not with happiness. Mrs. Faison's already critical eyes turned icy. She muttered something about bad timing and how this would complicate things. Mr. Faison remained silent but began excluding Sarah from conversations, family decisions, and even basic outings. The house grew colder, not in temperature, but in temperament. Where once Sarah had hoped for family, she now felt like a tenant, unwelcome and burdensome. Small cruelties followed. Her breakfast would accidentally be left uncooked. Doors would be closed in her face. Her laundry, always neatly folded, would mysteriously end up dirty again. She overheard whispers about how she was lazy, about how her baby would be a financial strain. Once, she found her vitamins flushed in the bathroom sink. Daniel said nothing. He never raised a hand, but his silence was deafening. When she confronted him gently one evening, asking if something was wrong, he sighed and said, "I didn't ask for this, Sarah." That was the end of the conversation. He walked out, and she cried herself to sleep that night. Each day chipped away at her hope. Sarah began keeping a diary, not just of daily chores or baby names, but of how she was feeling. Lost, isolated, afraid. There were no bruises on her skin, but her heart carried the scars of rejection and fear. She didn't know who to confide in. Her grandmother had passed away a year ago. Her few friends from before marriage had slowly drifted apart. She wasn't allowed a phone without supervision. Every call was monitored, every outing approved or denied. One rainy evening, she stood at the kitchen window, watching the water beat against the glass. Her hand instinctively rested on her stomach. She felt the baby kick, a small flutter of life. And despite everything, she smiled. It was a moment of light in her ever-darkening world. But even that joy was brief. Behind her, she heard her mother-in-law's voice sharp as a blade. "Don't get too comfortable. You're not here to sit around and dream." That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She stayed up, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling. She wasn't safe here, not truly. Something in the house had shifted, the way they looked at her, the coldness in Daniel's eyes, the subtle locking of her bedroom door. From the outside, the signs were there. She just didn't know yet what they meant, but she could feel it. Something was coming, and she had no one to turn to. It began like a kindness. One morning, after days of tight-lipped silence and stiff shoulders, Daniel gently knocked on Sarah's bedroom door. His tone was unusually soft when he said, "Pack a small bag. We're going away for a few days. Somewhere peaceful. You need rest for the baby." She blinked at him, unsure if she heard correctly. It was the first time in weeks that he had looked her in the eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked cautiously. "Just a little retreat. Fresh air, some quiet," he replied, not quite answering. "Amy and Abu are coming too." Her gut twisted slightly at that, but she nodded. Maybe this was a shift. Maybe they finally realized she needed support, not silence. She dared to hope, folding her clothes neatly into a small overnight bag, tucking in the baby's sonogram photo, like a charm protection. They left the next morning in the family car. Sarah sat in the back, wrapped in a shawl, watching the city blur into countryside. No one spoke much, but that wasn't new. Mr. Faison drove. Daniel stared out the window, and Mrs. Faison occasionally muttered things under her breath that Sarah couldn't hear. The road narrowed the deeper they went, trees growing taller and denser with each mile. After nearly 2 hours, they turned onto an unpaved road that looked almost forgotten, lined with thick brush and vines. "Is this where the retreat is?" she asked. Daniel nodded, still not looking at her, just a little farther in. When the car finally stopped, it was in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. No buildings, no cabins, just raw, wild forest. Sarah looked around, confused. "Where's the resort?" "We thought a proper picnic first." Mrs. Faison answered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A blanket was spread, sandwiches unwrapped, juice poured. Sarah was hesitant but drank when Daniel handed her a cup. The liquid tasted slightly bitter, odd for juice, but she said nothing. Within minutes, her head started spinning. Her limbs grew heavy. She reached for Daniel's arm, alarmed, but he gently eased her down onto the blanket. "You need to rest," he said, his voice now distant, warping. Her vision blurred. The sky tilted. She heard muffled footsteps moving away, and her own heart pounding in her ears. And then blackness. When Sarah woke, it was nearly dusk. The light filtering to the canopy was pale and gold, like fire trapped behind green glass. She sat up slowly, her head throbbing, throat dry. The blanket was gone. The food was gone. The car was gone. They were gone. Panic surged through her body like a flood. "Daniel," she called out, her voice cracking. "Amy? Abu." Her cries were met only with a sighing wind and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. Her body was weak and her belly ached. She braced herself against a tree, pushing up slowly. The forest felt alive around her. Too alive. Every sound was amplified. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, insects buzzed at her ears. Fear clawed up her throat. She began walking in the direction she thought they had come from, but everything looked the same. Trees and more trees. No tire tracks. No path. No sign of civilization. She walked until her knees gave out again. Why? She whispered to the ground. Why would they? The answer echoed in her mind before she could finish the question. They didn't want the baby. They didn't want me. Night descended quickly, wrapping the forest in shadows. The air grew colder. She curled up beneath a tree, holding her belly, whispering prayers between sobs. Her lips were cracked, her clothes damp from the forest floor. But she didn't care. Please, she whispered to no one. Don't let me die out here. Don't let my baby die. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped. She froze. The woods held their breath. Was it an animal? Something worse? She squeezed her eyes shut. Cut to. Back at the Faison home. The living room was warm, lights glowing softly. Mrs. Faison was laughing, sipping tea. Daniel scrolled through his phone, emotionless. She was unstable, Mrs. Faison said casually. We did what we had to do. We'll tell them she ran away, Mr. Faison added. That she couldn't handle the pressure. A mentally disturbed girl. People will believe it. Daniel said nothing. She brought this on herself, Mrs. Faison added, setting her cup down with a clink. We gave her everything, and all she did was bring shame and trouble. Their laughter faded into the background as the camera, if one existed, panned away, back toward the silent forest where a woman now lay, cold and alone, but not unseen. Unbeknownst to them, someone had heard her, and someone was already moving through the trees. Elias had long stopped counting the days since he'd chosen the forest over the world. Years ago, before the trees became his home and silence became his only companion, he was Dr. Elias Arun, a skilled veterinarian with a bright future, a loving wife named Layla, and a toddler son who adored every living creature just like his father. Life had been ordinary in the best ways. Until a single rainy night shattered it all. A drunk driver, a slippery road, and a phone call that changed everything. He never made it to the hospital in time. And after the funeral, nothing made sense anymore. The city that once felt familiar became suffocating. The sounds of people, the flashing lights, the everyday noise, they were unbearable. Grief hollowed him out. And so he left. He bought a small cabin deep within a privately owned stretch of forest land and never looked back. The locals whispered about him. A man who lived alone, spoke to animals, and appeared only when absolutely necessary. The nearby town called him the Forest Man, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity. He was neither feared nor welcomed, simply forgotten. And that was how Elias preferred it. He built a quiet routine. Each day began before sunrise, with a simple breakfast and a long hike to check his motion-activated cameras and wildlife traps, humane ones used only for monitoring or rescuing injured animals. Over the years, he had treated owls with broken wings, foxes caught in old barbed wire, and even a lone wolf with a crushed paw. Helping animals gave him purpose, a way to keep his hands busy when his heart still ached. On the day he found Sarah, he hadn't expected anything unusual. It had rained the night before, and he figured some of the cameras might have been knocked off their hinges by the wind or curious raccoons. As he sat reviewing the memory cards on his old laptop, something flickered across the screen that made his stomach knot. It was a woman, barefoot, limping, her clothes wet with mud. Her movements were slow, almost disoriented, as if each step was a battle. She passed one of his camera traps, glancing around like a hunted animal. And then he saw her hold her belly. Pregnant. Elias leaned in closer. He ran the footage again. She was alone, afraid, and from a look in her eyes, she had no idea where she was. He froze. There was a war inside him. He had told himself long ago that he would no longer involve himself in the affairs of people. They had taken too much from him already. But this wasn't just people. This was a woman, vulnerable and expecting, wandering deep into terrain that could easily turn deadly in a single night. What had brought her here? Who had abandoned her? He tried to push the question away, but the image of her stumbling through the trees stayed in his mind, even as he tried to busy himself with chores. It stayed while he cleaned a bird feeder, while he refilled a trough for a deer that often visited. It haunted him through lunch and well into dusk. By the time the sun had dropped behind the trees, he had packed a thermal blanket, a first aid kit, and a bottle of water into his knapsack. Grabbing his lantern and rifle, just in case, he stepped out into the night. His heart beat faster than usual, a strange mix of fear and instinct. Maybe this was none of his business. Maybe she'd already been found. But something deeper told him otherwise. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew what it meant to be lost. He knew what it meant to scream in silence and pray someone would hear. And now someone had. The forest was darker than Elias remembered. The storm clouds overhead blocked most of the moonlight, and the heavy canopy swallowed what little light remained. His lantern swung with each step, casting flickering shadows across the undergrowth. Despite years of navigating these woods, tonight felt different, heavier somehow, like the forest itself knew something was wrong. He moved carefully, scanning the ground for footprints, disturbed leaves, or any broken twigs that might indicate her path. It was nearing midnight when he heard it, a low groan, barely audible over the rustling trees. He followed the sound until the beam of his lantern landed on her. She lay curled beside a tree, one hand detectively resting on her swollen stomach, her body trembling from the cold. Mud caked her arms and legs, her lips were pale, and her breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. For a moment, Elias stood frozen, struck by the fragility of the scene. She looked less like a woman, and more like a broken bird fallen from the sky. Without a word, he knelt beside her and checked her pulse, weak but steady. Relief washed over him. "You're okay," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. Moving gently, he wrapped her in the thermal blanket and lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, her body light but limp. He carried her through the woods with practiced precision, following the trail only he knew by heart. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, the warmth from the wood stove rushing out to meet them. He laid her down on the old cot near the fire, then moved quickly, boiling water, fetching clean towels, preparing simple broth. He worked in silence, cleaning the scrapes on her arms and knees, checking her for fever, and wiping the sweat from her brow. Through the night, he sat by her side, watching as she drifted in and out of restless sleep. Occasionally, she whimpered, a name, maybe, or a cry. Once, she jolted upright, eyes wide with terror. Elias gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said calmly. "You're safe now." It wasn't until the next morning that her eyes fully opened. She blinked several times, squinting at the sunlight filtering through the cabin window. Panic instantly spread across her face as she tried to sit up, clutching the blanket to her chest. Where am I?" she croaked, voice dry and raspy. Elias held up his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "It's okay. You're in my cabin. You were unconscious when I found you." She looked around wildly, taking in the unfamiliar space. The wood-paneled walls, the fireplace, the shelves lined with herbal jars and animal medicine. Her eyes darted to the man standing before her, tall and weathered, with eyes that looked both tired and kind. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name's Elias," he replied, stepping back slightly to give her space. "I live nearby. I saw you on one of my wildlife cameras and went looking. You were alone. You were freezing." Her lips trembled. "They left me," she said after a pause. "My family, my husband, they just left me there." He said nothing, only nodded slowly. She tried to stand but immediately winced, grabbing her side. "Careful," Elias said, stepping forward again. "You're still very weak, and you have a few bruised ribs. You need rest and fluids." Despite her fear, she nodded. Something in his voice was steady, grounding. Over the next few days, Sarah slowly regained her strength. Elias kept his distance, but made sure she was always comfortable. He cooked soft, nourishing meals, soups, warm porridge, herbal teas, and left them beside her bed. He brought extra blankets when the wind howled outside, and he always knocked gently before entering the room, waiting for her permission. At first, their conversations were short and cautious. "Thank you," she murmured one night. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. Still, she did every day. It wasn't until the fourth evening, as they sat across from each other in the candlelit cabin, that she finally opened up. She told him her name, Sarah, that she was 7 months pregnant, that she had been married for just over a year, that her in-laws hated her, that her husband changed after she got pregnant, that they had taken her out for rest, but instead abandoned her like she was nothing. Elias listened without interruption. His hands remained still, his eyes fixed gently on her face. When she finished, her voice broke. "They didn't want me," she said. "They didn't want the baby either." He didn't say he understood. He didn't offer cliches. But he reached for a small ceramic cup of chamomile tea, warm and steady, and handed it to her, a silent gesture of care. In the days that followed, a strange rhythm emerged. Sarah helped with little things, feeding the animals, folding blankets, organizing herbs. Elias never pried into her past again, but sometimes he would tell her small stories about a deer he rescued, about a storm that once nearly blew the roof off his cabin, about the time a raccoon ate all his stored rice. There was no romance between them, no need for it. Not now. But there was trust and something softer forming beneath it, a bond not born of affection, but of survival. They were two broken people in a broken world, trying, in the quiet of the forest, to feel whole again. The days in the forest were quiet, but no longer silent. Where once the cabin echoed only with creaking wood and the crackle of fire, now there were voices, soft, hesitant at first, but slowly growing stronger. Sarah was no longer just a guest in Elias's home. She was becoming a presence, not one that demanded space, but one that filled it with quiet warmth. Physically, her body was healing. The bruises faded, her appetite returned, and her strength slowly rebuilt. Her baby miraculously remained healthy, stubborn and strong inside her womb, kicking with life. Every movement reminded her that survival was not just for her sake, but for the child growing inside her. But the emotional wounds ran deeper. Sarah often woke up in cold sweats, haunted by nightmares of being abandoned again, alone in the forest, running barefoot, hearing the taunting laughter of her in-laws echoing between the trees. She would wake in panic, clutching her stomach, breathing hard. Elias never entered without knocking, but he'd leave warm tea or a damp cloth outside her door. He never asked for details. He never needed to. He had lived in the darkness too. One crisp morning, as fog still clung low across the clearing, Elias handed her a hand-carved walking stick and said, "Come on, time to learn how to live out here." She blinked. "I already have." He shook his head gently. "No, you survived, but now you fight back." What began as slow walks through the woods turned into training. Elias showed her how to track animal prints, identify edible plants, start a fire without matches. Then came the harder lessons: how to swing a branch or the fence, where to strike an attacker if needed, how to listen to the forest when it tries to warn you. Sarah learned quickly, her movements uncertain at first, but sharper each day. Her body, once frail, began to feel grounded. Her posture changed. Her voice carried more weight. One afternoon, she managed to knock Elias off balance with a clean shoulder move he had taught her just 2 days earlier. They both laughed, a real laugh. It echoed through the trees like music. That night, they sat by the fire, drinking pine tea in worn mugs. Sarah was wrapped in a wool blanket, her hair pulled back, her cheeks glowing from effort and cold air. "You've done this before," she said, half smiling. "Taught someone to survive." Elias stared into the flames. His fingers tightened around his mug. "No," he said quietly. "Not like this." There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice a whisper of smoke. "I had a wife," he began. "Layla. She used to laugh like you just did. Our son was only 3. He loved birds. Used to try to feed them bread from his little hands. One night, I was late getting home from the clinic. They went out to get dessert. Just a quick drive." Sarah said nothing, watching the flicker of pain in his expression. A drunk driver ran a red light. Took them both. His voice cracked. After that, I couldn't stay. Not in that house. Not in that life. So I came here. Thought if I disappeared, maybe the grief would too. But it didn't, Sarah said gently. No, Elias admitted. It didn't. But it got quieter. Sarah reached over, placing her hand softly over his. No words were needed. In the space between their silences, something new had grown, a bond forged not from pity or need, but from the mutual understanding of deep, aching loss. They were two souls scarred by different tragedies, drawn together not to fix one another, but to walk the broken path side by side. In the forest, far from the world that had failed them both, they began to heal, not just as individuals, but as witnesses to each other's survival. It began with the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Elias was chopping wood when he heard it, the unnatural hum of engines breaking the forest's sacred quiet. He paused, axe in hand, brows furrowing. No one ever came this deep into the woods unless they were lost or looking for something. Moments later, two black SUVs emerged through the narrow path, dust swirling behind them. The vehicles bore official markings. Police. Elias's chest tightened. He dropped the axe and moved quickly toward the cabin, instincts flaring. Inside, Sarah was sitting on the cot, reading an old wildlife journal Elias had given her. She looked up when he entered, instantly sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, already starting to rise. "They're here," he said. "Police. Stay inside. I'll talk to them." But it was too late. The knock came fast and hard, followed by a firm voice. "Mr. Elias Arun, this is the provincial police. We have questions regarding a missing person report." Sarah's eyes widened. "They found me." The door opened, and 3 officers stepped in, their hands near their weapons. One of them, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, looked directly at Elias. "Where is she?" Elias raised his hands slightly. "She's here. She's safe. She was never held against her will." The lead officer stepped aside, and Sarah moved forward, arms out protectively. "He saved me," she said, voice strong despite the nerves in her eyes. "They're wrong. I wasn't kidnapped. I was left to die. And this man, Elias, he kept me alive." The officers hesitated, exchanging glances. "Ma'am," one said more gently now, "we've been searching for you for nearly 2 weeks. Your in-laws filed a report. They said you ran away, that you were mentally unstable." Sarah shook her head. "They're lying. They drugged me, abandoned me in the forest. I was pregnant and alone. They wanted me gone." They took her words seriously now. Within the hour, Sarah was carefully escorted out of the forest. Elias stood at the edge of the trail, watching the SUV disappear between the trees, her silhouette visible in the back window. She looked back once, just before the bend, and their eyes met. Neither of them waved, but neither looked away. 2 days later, hospital. Sarah lay in a clean hospital bed, her baby's heartbeat echoing steadily on the monitor beside her. Nurses came and went, asking polite questions, but her mind was elsewhere, on Elias, on the forest, and on the truth now finally beginning to surface. A young female officer came into her room with a folder and a soft expression. "Sarah," she began gently, "I thought you should know. We've started investigating your husband's family, and what we're finding confirms your story." Sarah sat up slightly, heart racing. "There are inconsistencies in their statements. Forged medical notes about your supposed mental instability, and financial records showing life insurance policies under your name filed just 2 months ago. We also have a forensics report confirming sedatives in your bloodstream, something not consistent with your medical prescriptions." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from relief. "Daniel," she asked, voice trembling, being questioned, "and your in-laws are under formal investigation for attempted murder and criminal negligence. We're requesting protective custody for you and the baby, just in case." Sarah nodded slowly. She had fought so hard to survive, and now, finally, someone believed her. Meanwhile, Forest cabin. Elias sat on his porch, hands wrapped around a mug of bitter black tea. The authorities had questioned him for hours. He had cooperated fully, shown them camera footage, and shared every detail from the moment he found Sarah. They checked his records. Clean. Still, suspicion lingered. A man living alone in the woods, off-grid, with a young woman? The narrative was too easy to twist. But in the end, truth won. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. The lead officer had even said something kind before leaving. "You probably saved 2 lives, Mr. Haroon. Don't hide from the world forever." Elias didn't answer. He just nodded and stared quietly into the woods, listening to the wind as it whispered through the trees. The news broke quietly at first, just a local report from a small-town journalist. Pregnant woman abandoned in forest survives against all odds. But the story was too harrowing to stay small. Within days, it was everywhere. Sarah's name became a symbol of strength. Her photo, frail but fierce, holding her newborn baby in the hospital, circulated on every major platform. People read with outrage, with disbelief, and with admiration. How could a family cast out a woman carrying their grandchild? How did she survive in the wild? And who was the man who saved her? Behind the headlines, justice was quietly and methodically unfolding. Daniel was arrested on multiple charges: conspiracy to commit attempted murder, falsifying medical records, obstruction of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. His silence, once his weapon, now worked against him. Interrogators uncovered conversations, bank records, and witness accounts that painted a grim but clear picture. He had known, he had agreed, and he had walked away. Mr. and Mrs. Faison were charged with attempted murder, intentional abandonment, and fraud. When confronted, their denial crumbled under the weight of recorded statements, Sarah's testimony, and Elias's camera footage. No amount of influence or manipulation could save them this time. Sarah chose not to attend the hearings in person. Instead, she focused on the life that had just entered the world. Her daughter, Hope, born 3 weeks after Sarah left the hospital. The baby arrived in a quiet maternity ward, surrounded by gentle nurses, warm light, and the absence of cruelty. Sarah held her close, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered the name she had chosen the night Elias first placed a bowl of soup at her bedside. Hope, because that's what had carried her forward. Because that's what the forest had given her. Public support poured in. Women's rights groups, activists, survivors of domestic abuse, all sent messages of solidarity. Donations were raised. A renowned women's aid foundation stepped in and offered Sarah safe housing, legal assistance, and long-term therapy. She accepted, not because she was weak, but because she now understood the strength in asking for help. And as for Elias, he didn't speak to the media, despite the growing requests. He declined every interview, every invitation. But a single photo surfaced, a candid shot of him standing at the edge of the forest, half smiling as he fed a squirrel from his hand. The caption read, "The man who didn't look away." The forest looked different in the light of spring. Lush, alive, and full of sound, not threatening anymore, but vibrant with promise. Birds chirped high in the branches, and the wind moved gently through the tall grass as if whispering old secrets. The same forest that once swallowed Sarah in fear now welcomed her back like an old friend. She stood at the edge of the clearing, baby Hope nestled in her arms. Dressed in a pale yellow onesie and soft blanket, the child blinked curiously at the dappled sunlight above. Sarah took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp soil grounding her. The cabin looked just as she remembered, simple, sturdy, eternal. And there he was, Elias, sitting on the porch, a mug of tea in one hand, a small knife in the other, whittling wood as he always did. He looked up when he heard her steps. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he smiled, a quiet, contented smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You found your way back," he said softly. Sarah nodded. "I wanted to see the forest again. I wanted her to see where she began." Elias rose and stepped down from the porch. His eyes met the baby's, and for a moment, a shadow of emotion crossed his face. Recognition, perhaps, or wonder. He reached out gently and touched the edge of the blanket, careful not to startle. "She's beautiful," he murmured. "She's strong," Sarah added with pride. They walked to the old log near the stream, the same place where Sarah had once learned how to track footprints and light fires. They sat together in silence, listening to the rustle of leaves, the soft gurgle of water nearby. Hope slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the wind. Neither of them said what they were thinking. They didn't need to. The connection between them wasn't built on grand declarations, but on shared silence, on survival, on the steady rebuilding of trust. Whether it would blossom into something deeper, they didn't know. Perhaps it didn't need to. Perhaps what they had was already enough. But one thing was certain. She was never alone again. The forest remembered everything. It remembered the lies whispered among the trees, the fear that bled into its soil, and the woman who stumbled through its shadows with nothing but a heartbeat and hope. It remembered the silence, thick and cruel, and the man who dared to break it. But time softened even the sharpest memories. Now, in the dappled light of late summer, the forest hummed with life. The same trees that once stood as silent witnesses to pain now swayed gently, their leaves whispering lullabies to a child who giggled in her mother's arms. Elias still lived quietly in his cabin. He tended to wounded birds, sketched in his journal, and walked the woods with a softer step. But there was a change, small, steady. Sometimes laughter echoed near his porch. Sometimes a little girl's curious voice asked about the names of flowers or the shapes of clouds. And sometimes Sarah came alone just to sit, breathe, and remember. They never tried to label what had grown between them. They didn't need to. It was enough to share the silence, to trust its comfort instead of fearing its emptiness. The forest, once a place of abandonment, had become a sanctuary, not just for Sarah, not just for Elias, but for all broken things seeking space to grow again. Under the ancient canopy, among the roots and rivers and wind, healing bloomed. The forest had seen darkness, but it had also seen light return. And in the quiet heart of that wilderness, it remembered her not as the woman who was left to perish, but as the one who came back stronger.